Diese Anfrage Herrn Roosevelts an uns oder die Besitzungen voneinander unabhängiger Nationen nicht angreifen und vor allem nicht dort einmarschieren würden.
On January 30th, 1933, I moved into Wilhelmstrasse filled with the deepest concern for the future of my folk. Today, 6 years later, I am able to speak to the first Reichstag of Greater Germany. We, perhaps more than any other generation, can truly appreciate the full meaning of the pious expression. What a change brought about by the grace of God. 6 years were enough to achieve the dreams of centuries. 1 year to bring our people the enjoyment of that unity that so many generations strove for in vain. Today, as I see you assembled around me as representatives of our German folk from all Gaue of the Reich, and know that among you are the newly elected men of the Ostmark and the Sudetenland, I'm once more overwhelmed by the powerful impressions of the events of a year in which the work of centuries was realized. How much blood has been shed in vain for this goal? Over the course of more than 1,000 years, how many millions of German men have consciously or unconsciously traveled down the bitter road toward a quick or painful death in the service of this goal? How many others were condemned to end their lives behind the walls of fortresses and prisons, lives they would have gladly given to Greater Germany? How many hundreds of thousands have poured forth into the whole wide world, an endless stream of German emigrants driven by need and worry? For decades, they still thought of their unhappy fatherland, but after generations, they forgot it, and within a single year, this dream has been successfully realized. Not without a fight, as some thoughtless bourgeois may perhaps like to think. This year of German unity was preceded by nearly 2 decades of fanatical struggle on behalf of a political idea. Hundreds of thousands, millions devoted their entire selves to this, their physical and economic existence. They accepted mockery and derision as readily as they did years of disgraceful abuse, vile defamation, and nearly unbearable terror. Countless blood-soaked dead and wounded in all the German Gaue were witnesses to this battle. Moreover, this success was hard-won through an immense exertion of will and through the power of brave decisions fanatically adhered to. I am saying this because there is a danger that those very people who contributed the least to the practical success of German unity are now, as the loudest of declaimers, only too quick to claim the creation of the Reich as their own doing, or to depict the events of 1938 as a matter of course, a development that was long overdue and unfortunately only belatedly finally achieved by National Socialism. As far as these elements are concerned, I would like to say that persevering through this year required uncommonly strong nerves, something of which these midgets have nary a trace. They are the incorrigible old pessimists, skeptics, and indifferentists that we know so well, those who made no positive contribution during our 20-year struggle, but who now, after the victory, feel compelled to make their critical comments as the appointed experts on the nation's rebirth. We are truly fighting an immense battle, applying all the unified power and energy of our folk, and we will win this fight completely. In fact, we have already won it. Wherein lies the root cause of all our economic difficulties? In the overpopulation of our living space. And here I can present the gentlemen critics in the Western and non-European democracies with one fact and one question. The fact the German folk lives with a ration of 135 people per square kilometer, without any outside help and without any of the reserves it once had. Plundered by the rest of the world for a decade and a half, burdened with immense debts, without colonies, it has nevertheless fed and clothed its people and, moreover, has no unemployment. And the question, which of our so-called great democracies would be able to accomplish as much? Of course, the person for whom bananas simply grow on trees has an easier struggle for existence than the German farmer who must exert himself all year long to work his field. Here, we would only ask that this carefree international banana picker not criticize the activities of the German farmer. The condition that would then occur can only be overcome in two ways. One, through the importation of additional foodstuffs, which would mean an increase in the export of German products, whereby one would have to consider that some of the raw materials necessary for the manufacture of these very products would have to be imported from abroad, so that only a fraction of the remaining profits would be available for the purchase of foodstuffs or two. The expansion of the living space of our folk in order to resolve the problem of feeding Germany within our domestic economy. Since the second solution is not yet feasible on account of the persistent blindness of the one-time victorious powers, we are forced to deal with the first one. That is, we must export in order to be able to buy food. And second, since some of this export would require raw materials that we ourselves do not possess, we must export even more to secure these raw materials for our economy. This necessity is certainly not a capitalistic one, as may be the case in other countries, but rather results from the direst need that can afflict a people, namely concern for their daily bread. And when foreign statesmen now threaten us with economic countermeasures of some kind or another, I can only assure them that this would initiate a desperate economic struggle in which we could easily hold our own. We could do so more easily than the satiated other nations, for the motive for our economic struggle would be a very simple one, namely, German people either live, that means export, or die. And I can assure all international skeptics, the German folk will not die. Most certainly not because of this, but it will live. If necessary, it will place all of the productive capacity of the new National Socialist community at the disposal of its leadership in order to enter into such a struggle and fight to the end. As far as the leadership is concerned, I can only assure you that it is determined to do whatever is necessary. However, a final solution to this problem, and a reasonable one at that, will only occur when common human reason triumphs over the greed of individual nations. That is, when people have learned that insisting upon an injustice is not only politically but also economically useless, indeed insane. We have no reason to assume that Germany's fate would be any different if it were ever to succumb to a second bout of weakness in the future. On the contrary, some of the same men who once threw the world into the firestorm of war are still trying today as the driving forces or paid henchmen of those who promote hatred among the nations to heighten animosities in order to prepare the ground for a new conflict. And above all else, there is one thing that you, especially my dear delegates, men of the Reichstag, must not forget. In certain democracies, it is apparently one of the special prerogatives of political democratic life to nurse an artificial hatred against so-called totalitarian states. Through a flood of reports, partly distortions, partly utter fabrications, public opinion is turned against nations who have not done anything to other nations and have no intention of doing them any harm, who, at most, were themselves oppressed by severe injustice for decades. And when we now defend ourselves against such apostles of war like Mr. Duff Cooper, Mr. Eden, Churchill, or Mr. Ickes, and so on, this is presented as an encroachment upon the sacred rights of democracies. As these gentlemen see it, they certainly have the right to attack other nations and their leadership, but no one has the right to defend himself. I do not need to reassure you that as long as the German Reich is a sovereign state, the state leadership will not let an English or an American politician keep it from responding to such attacks. That we remain a sovereign state will be ensured in the future by the weapons we are forging and by the choice of our friends. One could simply dismiss the claim that Germany intends to attack America with laughter, and it might be best to pass over in silence the continuing campaign of incitement by certain British war apostles, except that we must not ignore the following. 1. These democracies are states whose political construction makes the following possible: that only a few months down the road, these most horrible of warmongers could hold the leadership of the government in their own hands. 2, we therefore owe it to the security of the Reich to tell the German folk the truth about these men in a timely fashion. The German folk feels no hatred toward England, America, or France. It just wants peace and quiet. Those nations, however, are being continuously stirred up against Germany and the German folk by their Jewish or non-Jewish agitators. Thus, should the intentions of these warmongers succeed, our own folk would wind up in a situation for which they would be psychologically unprepared and which they would be unable to comprehend. I therefore consider it necessary that from now on our propaganda and our press should always answer these attacks, and that, above all, they should be brought to the attention of the German folk. It needs to know who the men are who want to start a war at all costs. I am convinced that the calculations of these elements are faulty, for once the National Socialist propaganda begins to answer back, we will be just as successful as we were within Germany when we brought the Jewish world enemy to its knees through the compelling force of our propaganda. The nations will soon realize that National Socialist Germany seeks no enmity with other nations, that all claims that our folk intends to attack other nations are the product of a pathological hysteria or are lies spawned by the personal desire of certain politicians to survive, that in certain states these lies are intended to help unconscionable profiteers protect their financial interest, that international Jewry most of all hopes to satisfy its thirst for revenge and its lust for profit by means of these lies, and that they represent the most outrageous slander that one can inflict on a great and peace-loving nation. After all, German soldiers have never fought on American soil, for example, except in service to American independence and its struggle for liberty. But American soldiers were certainly brought to Europe to help strangle a great nation fighting for its freedom. It is not Germany that has attacked America, but America that has attacked Germany. And as the investigative committee in the American House of Representatives determined, it did so without any compelling cause, merely for capitalistic motives. But everyone should be clear about one thing. These attempts will have no influence whatsoever on Germany, especially on the way it is resolving its Jewish question. Let me say the following about the Jewish question. It is a shameful spectacle to see today how the entire world of democracy is oozing with compassion toward the poor, tormented Jewish people, while remaining hard-heartedly stubborn in the face of what is an obvious duty to help them. The arguments that are used to excuse this failure actually speak only for us Germans and Italians, for it is said, 1. We, that is the democracies, are not in a position to take in the Jews, and yet in these world empires there are not even 10 people per square kilometer, while Germany has to feed 135 per square kilometer and is still supposed to be able to accommodate them. 2, we are told we cannot take them unless they are given by Germany, for example, a certain amount of capital for immigration. For centuries, however, it was perfectly all right for Germany to receive these elements, though they possessed nothing except infectious political and sanitary diseases. What that people possesses today, it has acquired by way of the vilest manipulations at the expense of the not very astute German folk. Today, we are merely undoing the harm for which these people are themselves to blame. Back when the German folk lost its entire savings from decades of honest work to the inflation instigated and promoted by the Jews, when the rest of the world took away the German folk's foreign assets, when we were dispossessed of all our colonial possessions, such philanthropic considerations do not seem to have had any meaningful influence on these democratic statesmen. Today, I can only assure these gentlemen that we, thanks to the brutal education that the democracies have inflicted upon us for 15 years, are completely hardened against any sentimental stirrings. We witnessed how, after more than 800,000 of our children had already died of hunger and undernourishment at the end of the war, nearly 1 million dairy cows were driven away in accordance with the cruel provisions of a dictate that the democratic, humane apostles of the world forced upon us as a peace treaty. We witnessed how more than 1 million German prisoners of war were kept in confinement for no reason at all for a whole year after the war ended. We had to endure that well over 1 million Germans in our border regions were torn from their property and possessions and driven out with almost nothing but the clothes on their backs. We had to bear millions of our Volk comrades being torn away from us with no one offering them a hearing or leaving them even the smallest possibility of sustaining their lives. I could supplement these examples with dozens that are more horrendous still. Do not speak to us, then, of humanity. The German folk does not wish for its affairs to be determined and governed by a foreign nation. France to the French, England to the English, America to the Americans, and Germany to the Germans. We are determined to stop a foreign people from nesting here, a people that has known how to seize all leadership positions and to deport it. For we are willing to educate our own people for these leadership positions. We have hundreds of thousands of intelligent children of farmers and workers. We will have them educated, and we are already educating them, and we want them, not the members of a people that is alien to us, to one day occupy the leading positions in the state alongside our educated classes. Most of all, however, German culture is, as the very name suggests, a German and not a Jewish one, and its administration and care will therefore be placed in the hands of our Volk. If, however, the rest of the world cries out with a hypocritical mien about the barbaric expulsion from Germany of such an irreplaceable, culturally valuable element, we can only be astonished by the conclusions that can be drawn from this. How grateful they should be to us for setting free these wonderful bearers of culture and making them available to the rest of the world. In accordance with their own statements, the rest of the world cannot find a single reason to excuse themselves for refusing to admit these highly worthy people into their own countries. It is, after all, impossible to understand why the members of this race are inflicted on the German folk, while the states that are so enthusiastic about these splendid people suddenly refuse to admit them with all kinds of excuses. I believe that the sooner this problem is solved, the better, for Europe will not find peace until the Jewish question has been settled. It is perfectly possible that this problem will lead sooner or later to an agreement in Europe, even between nations that would otherwise not have reconciled so easily. The world has enough settlement space, but one must, once and for all, break with the notion that the Jewish people have simply been chosen by the Lord God to be the beneficiaries of a certain percentage of the body and productive work of other peoples. Jewry will have to adjust to the kind of respectable, constructive activity that other nations are already engaged in. Otherwise, it will succumb sooner or later to a crisis of unimaginable scope. And another thing I want to say on this day, which may be memorable for others as well as us Germans, I was often a prophet in my life and was usually ridiculed for it. At the time of my struggle for power, it was chiefly the Jewish people who laughed at my prophecies that I would one day assume in Germany the leadership of the state and thus the entire folk, and would then, among other things, also bring the Jewish problem to a solution. I believe, however, that the Jews in Germany have already choked on the uproarious laughter of those days. I wish to be a prophet again today. Should international financial Jewry in and outside of Europe succeed in plunging the nations once again into a world war, the result will not be the Bolshevization of the world and thus the victory of Jewry, but the annihilation of the Jewish race in Europe. For the time of the propagandistic impotence of the non-Jewish peoples is over. National Socialist Germany and Fascist Italy possess the institutions that allow them, if necessary, to enlighten the world about the nature of a question of which many peoples are instinctively aware, but have not thought clearly about. At the moment, Jewry may, in certain states, pursue its smear campaign under the protection of press, film, radio propaganda, theater, literature, etc., which are in its hands. But should that people succeed once again in driving the nation's masses of millions into a struggle that is entirely senseless for them and serves only Jewish interests, we shall see the effectiveness of an education in Germany to which Jewry has completely succumbed within a few short years. The nations no longer wish to die on the battlefield so that this rootless international race can profit from the business of war and satisfy its Old Testament lust for vengeance. The Jewish slogan, "Proletarians of all countries unite," will be defeated by a higher realization, namely, working members of all nations recognize your common enemy. My delegates, men of the First Reichstag of Greater Germany. As I now conclude my remarks to you today, I look back once more on the years of struggle and fulfillment that lie behind us. For most of us, they represent the meaning and content of our entire existence. We know that nothing greater can be granted to our folk and thus to ourselves. Without bloodshed, we have succeeded finally in erecting the great Reich of the German folk. Still, we should not forget that this process too brought painful losses for some. Many cherished traditions, many dear memories and symbols had to be eliminated by us. States were wiped out, their flags taken down, their traditions have lost meaning. May all of us, however, find comfort in the realization that in our history, no generation that worked on behalf of Germany was spared similarly painful experiences. Ever since the first German dukes struggled to create higher entities out of savage tribes, their efforts had to tread upon cherished institutions, dear memories, manly obligations of loyalty, and so forth. This process lasted nearly 2,000 years, until scattered tribes became one folk, countless lands and states, one Reich. Now, the growth process of the German nation can be seen as having essentially come to an end. The greater German Reich, however, encompasses the entire 1,000-year life struggle of our folk. Just as all streams of German blood flow into it, it unites in itself all past traditions, its symbols and banners, and above all, the great men of whom Germans of the past were once justly proud. For no matter what camp they belonged to in their day, the bold dukes and great kings, the generals and mighty emperors, and around them the shining minds and heroes of the past, they were all merely instruments of providence in the process of creating a nation. By embracing them with grateful reverence in this great Reich, the glorious richness of German history opens up to us. Let us thank Almighty God that He has blessed our generation and us to witness this time and this hour.